The needle slipped through cream-colored silk for the 300th time that week, and Margaret Porter's fingers ached with every stitch. Outside her kitchen window, June heat pressed against Louisville's west end like a damp towel, but inside the cramped apartment above Donnelly's hardware, Margaret barely noticed. She had 5 hours until the wedding. Her wedding. And the dress laid across her lap still needed hemming. The bodice required reinforcement, and somewhere in the pile of salvaged fabric beside her chair lay the pearl buttons that would make the whole thing hold together. If her hands didn't give out first. "Mama, is that going to be pretty?" 4-year-old Danny stood in the doorway, his bare feet dusty from playing in the alley, clutching the stuffed rabbit Margaret had sewn from flour sacks the previous Christmas. "It's going to be perfect, baby." Margaret forced brightness into her voice, though the dress in her lap looked nothing like the magazine pictures Danny had helped her cut out and pin to the refrigerator with magnets. What she didn't tell her son: the silk had come from a box of forgotten fabric in the storage room of the textile mill where she worked third shift. The lace at the collar had been carefully unpicked from a tablecloth she'd found at the Salvation Army, and the foundation of the entire gown, the structure that gave it shape and substance, had been cut from another wedding dress entirely. A dress that had belonged to someone else's mother. Someone who would be waiting at the end of that church aisle in exactly 5 hours. Before we go any further, pause for just a moment and let me know. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments below, and if this story already has you curious, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. You won't want to miss how this unfolds. Margaret had met Thomas Brennan 4 months earlier, on a Tuesday night in February, when ice made the streets impassable and the mill sent everyone home early. She'd been carrying Danny piggyback through the freezing rain, her boy's thin jacket soaked through, when a black Lincoln pulled alongside them on 4th Street. The window rolled down. "Ma'am, you'll catch your death out here." Thomas Brennan didn't look like the kind of man who stopped for strangers. 28 years old, heir to Brennan Manufacturing, the largest furniture maker in 3 states. He wore a wool coat that probably cost more than Margaret made in 6 months. But his voice held no judgment, only concern. "We're fine," Margaret had said, even as Danny shivered against her back. "You're not fine. Please, let me give you a ride." She should have said no. Women like her didn't get into cars with men like him. But Danny's teeth were chattering, and her own feet had gone numb in her worn-through shoes. And sometimes desperation made decisions that pride couldn't afford. The interior of the Lincoln smelled like leather and rain and something expensive Margaret couldn't name. Thomas cranked the heat while Danny pressed his small hands against the dashboard vents. "Where to?" "Donnelly's Hardware on 7th. We live upstairs." Thomas didn't comment on the neighborhood or the fact that Margaret was clearly coming from the mill, her hair still netted, her hands stained with dye. He simply drove, making gentle conversation with Danny about the stuffed rabbit, about whether it snowed in Rabbit Land, about whether rabbits liked hot chocolate. By the time they reached Donnelly's, Danny was half asleep, and Margaret's defenses had cracked just enough to be dangerous. "Thank you," she'd said. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." Thomas had smiled then, and something in that smile suggested he understood exactly what it cost her to accept kindness from a stranger. "But I wanted to." She thought she'd never see him again. He came back the next night, and the next. Now, 4 months later, she was about to become his wife, and half of Louisville society was scandalized by the match. She'd heard the whispers at the grocery, caught the sidelong glances at the courthouse when they filed for the license. Margaret Porter, 26 years old, divorced mother, factory worker, marrying Thomas Brennan, whose family name was embossed on half the buildings downtown. The women at the mill had been kinder in their way. "You take that chance, honey," Agnes from the cutting floor had told her. "You take it and don't look back." But it was Mrs. Brennan, Thomas's mother, Caroline, who had surprised Margaret most. 2 weeks before the wedding, Caroline had invited Margaret to tea at the Brennan estate on Cherokee Road. Margaret had worn her church dress, the navy one with buttons that didn't quite match, and felt like an imposter the moment she stepped through the door. Caroline Brennan had been elegant, silver-haired, dying. The cancer had taken her quickly, Thomas had explained. She had maybe weeks left, but she'd insisted on meeting the woman her son intended to marry. "Come sit with me, dear." Caroline's voice had been soft but steady from her chair by the window overlooking the garden. "I want to see who's stolen my boy's heart." They'd talked for 2 hours. Not about money or status or what Louisville society thought. Caroline had asked about Danny, about Margaret's parents, both gone, about how she'd survived a marriage that had ended with bruises and a restraining order. And then, as Margaret was leaving, Caroline had taken her hand. "I have something for you. In the blue chest in my bedroom closet, there's a wedding dress. I wore it when I married Thomas's father 40 years ago. I want you to have it." Margaret had tried to refuse. "Mrs. Brennan, I couldn't possibly." "Yes, you can, and you will." Caroline's grip had been surprisingly strong. "That dress has been waiting for the right person. I think that's you." Caroline Brennan had died 8 days later on a Thursday morning while Thomas held her hand. The dress had arrived at Margaret's apartment the following week, delivered by Caroline's personal assistant with a note in shaky handwriting. "For Margaret. Wear it with joy." But when Margaret opened the box and lifted the gown, ivory silk, chantilly lace, pearl-studded bodice, her heart had broken. Moths had destroyed the skirt, water damage had yellowed the train, and the bodice, though structurally sound, was sized for a woman 3 inches taller and 20 pounds heavier than Margaret would ever be. The dress was unwearable, a ruin. Margaret had cried for an hour before she started taking it apart. Now, as the clock on her kitchen wall ticked toward 2 in the afternoon, Margaret held up the finished product. To anyone who didn't know, it looked like a simple cream-colored dress, modest, handmade, nothing special. But Margaret could see every piece of Caroline's gown woven into the structure. The silk she'd salvaged and recut, the lace she'd carefully repositioned, the pearl buttons she'd transferred from the original bodice. She'd rebuilt the dress from its bones, and in 3 hours, she would walk down the aisle of St. Catherine's Church, wearing every stitch of love she could sew into it. What Margaret didn't know, someone at that church was already sharpening their words. Someone who believed that women like Margaret Porter didn't belong in families like the Brennans. And they were about to make sure everyone knew it. St. Catherine's smelled like beeswax and old hymnals, and the lilies someone had arranged in mason jars along each pew. Margaret stood in the church basement, the concrete floor cool beneath her borrowed white flats, and tried to steady her breathing. Through the ceiling above, she could hear voices, the congregation arriving, shoes shuffling across wooden floors, the organist running scales in preparation. Danny pressed against her side, his small hand gripping the fabric of her dress. "You look like a princess, Mama." "Thank you, baby." Margaret smoothed his cowlick, the one that never stayed down no matter how much water she used. He wore a suit Thomas had bought him, navy blue with short pants and a clip-on tie, and he looked so grown up, It made her chest ache. Agnes from the mill appeared at the bottom of the stairs, her broad face flushed from the heat. "Margaret, honey, they're just about ready for you." She paused, taking in the dress, and something flickered across her features. Surprise, maybe, or concern. "That's what you're wearing?" Margaret's stomach dropped. "Is something wrong with it?" No, it's just—" Agnes caught herself. "You look lovely. Real lovely." But Margaret had seen that expression before. The same one the clerk at Levy's department store had given her when she'd asked about wedding dresses, when the woman had steered her toward the clearance rack with thin-lipped sympathy. Not good enough. Upstairs, the organ shifted into the opening chords of the processional. "That's your cue, sweetheart." Agnes squeezed Margaret's shoulder. "You go on up there and marry that man." The stairs seemed impossibly steep. Danny climbed beside her, one hand on the railing, his rabbit tucked under his other arm. At the top, someone had propped open the door to the sanctuary, and Margaret could see the afternoon light streaming through stained glass, painting the floor in blues and golds. Thomas stood at the altar in a dark suit, his hands clasped, his expression so open and hopeful that Margaret felt her throat tighten. But it was the faces in the pews that made her falter. She knew maybe a dozen people in that church, Agnes and a handful of women from the mill seated near the back. Mrs. Chen from the apartment below hers at Donnelly's, who sometimes watched Danny when Margaret worked late. Father Morrison, who'd agreed to perform the ceremony even though Margaret hadn't attended Mass since she was a girl. The rest, maybe 60 people, were Thomas's world. His father, stern-faced in the front row. His cousins and uncles and business associates. Their wives dressed in clothes that cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. Women wearing pearls and silk and expressions that ranged from curiosity to cold assessment. And in the third row, a woman Margaret didn't recognize leaned toward her companion. The words carried farther than the woman probably intended. "Lord have mercy. Is that what she's wearing?" A ripple of whispers spread through the sanctuary like water finding cracks in stone. Margaret's feet wanted to stop, wanted to turn around and carry Danny back down those stairs and out the side door and away from this place where she clearly didn't belong. But Thomas had seen her now, and his face had transformed, lit up with something so genuine that Margaret found herself moving forward despite everything. One step, another. Danny walked beside her, his small hand finding hers. "Margaret, you're doing great," Father Morrison whispered as she reached the altar. "Just a few more steps." But the whispers didn't stop. "Homemade, obviously. Poor thing probably can't afford anything better. Did you see the stitching at the hem? Caroline must be rolling in her grave." That last one hit like a fist. Margaret's vision blurred, but she blinked hard and focused on Thomas, who had stepped forward to meet her, his hand extended. "You're beautiful," he said quietly, and she could tell he meant it. Could also tell he'd heard the whispers and was trying to drown them out with certainty. Father Morrison opened his prayer book. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." "Excuse me." "Father." The voice came from the third row. The same woman who'd commented first. She stood now, her navy dress crisp, her gray hair set in perfect waves. Margaret recognized her from the society pages. Judith Carrington, old Louisville money, a friend of Carolyn's since childhood. "Yes, Mrs. Carrington?" Father Morrison's tone held a note of warning. "I apologize for the interruption, but I feel compelled to speak." Judith's gaze swept the sanctuary before landing on Margaret. We're here to witness a sacred union, a marriage that joins not just two people but two families. And I have to ask, is this really how we honor Caroline's memory? By allowing her son to marry someone who can't even be bothered to wear a proper dress? The silence that followed felt physical. Margaret's hands had gone numb. Beside her, Danny had gone very still, sensing the shift in the room the way children always could. Thomas's jaw tightened. Mrs. Carrington, I don't think... Let me finish, Thomas. Judith's voice had taken on the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Your mother was a woman of grace and dignity. She wore Chanel. She supported the arts. She understood what it meant to represent a family like yours. And now you're standing at the altar with... She gestured at Margaret. With a woman who shows up to her own wedding in something that looks like it came from a church rummage sale. Someone in the back pews gasped. Thomas's father had gone rigid, his hands gripping the pew in front of him, and Margaret wanted to disappear, wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. But Thomas didn't flinch. Instead, he turned to Margaret and smiled, gentle, knowing, and utterly unashamed. May I? She didn't understand what he was asking until he reached for the hem of her dress, lifting it slightly to reveal the interior seamwork, the pearls she'd transferred, the lace she'd repositioned, the silk that had been cut and reformed. Mrs. Carrington, Thomas said, his voice carrying to every corner of the sanctuary. You're absolutely right. This dress didn't come from a boutique or a department store. It didn't cost thousands of dollars, and it wasn't made by some fashion house in Paris. He paused, letting the words settle. This dress was made from my mother's wedding gown. The whispers stopped. Every eye in that church fixed on the fabric in Thomas's hands. The one she wore when she married my father 40 years ago. Thomas's voice had gone soft, but steady. She gave it to Margaret 2 weeks before she died, asked her to wear it. But the original dress was damaged. Moths, water, time. Most people would have seen it as garbage, as something to throw away. He looked at Margaret, and she saw tears gathering in his eyes. Margaret spent every night for the last 2 weeks taking that dress apart piece by piece. She saved every salvageable inch of fabric, every pearl button, every bit of lace. She cut and reshaped and rebuilt it into something new, something that would actually fit her, something she could wear without pretending to be someone she's not. Thomas turned back to Judith, and his expression had hardened. So yes, Mrs. Carrington, this is a homemade dress, made by a woman who works third shift at a textile mill to support her son. A woman who knows the value of every stitch because she's sewn flour sacks into stuffed animals and patched jeans until there's more patch than original fabric. A woman my mother chose because she recognized something you apparently can't see. The silence stretched thin as glass. Strength, Thomas said simply. Grace that doesn't require pearls or silk to be real. The kind of dignity my mother actually valued. The kind that rebuilds broken things instead of throwing them away. Judith Carrington's face had drained of color. She sat down without another word. Thomas took Margaret's hands, and she realized she was shaking. I'm sorry, he whispered. I should have told everyone from the start. I wanted them to see you first. See how beautiful you are before they knew the story. You knew they'd judge me, Margaret said, her voice barely audible. I knew some of them would, and I wanted them to be wrong. Father Morrison cleared his throat. Shall we continue? But Margaret was still processing what had just happened, the way the room had shifted, The way people who'd been whispering moments ago now looked embarrassed, their eyes averted. The way Thomas had defended her, not by diminishing her poverty or pretending it didn't exist, but by reframing it as something that made the dress more valuable, not less. She looked down at Danny, who smiled up at her with gap-toothed confidence. Then she looked at Thomas. "Yes," she said. "Let's continue." The ceremony proceeded without further interruption, though Margaret could feel the weight of every gaze on her transformed dress. But the whispers had changed. Instead of mockery, she heard something else floating through the pews as Father Morrison led them through their vows. Wonder, maybe, or the beginning of respect. When Thomas kissed her at the altar, the applause was genuine, led, surprisingly, by Thomas's father, whose stern expression had softened into something that might have been approval. But as they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Margaret caught Judith Carrington's eye. The woman wasn't clapping, and the look on her face suggested this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The parish hall behind St. Catherine's had been transformed with white streamers and borrowed folding tables covered in cotton cloths. Margaret stood near the punch bowl, still trembling from what had happened in the sanctuary, while Thomas greeted guests at the door. Danny had found 2 other children, the sons of one of Thomas's business partners, and was showing them his rabbit with serious importance. Across the room, Agnes and the mill women had claimed a corner table, their faces bright with vindication. "That was something else, honey," Agnes said, pulling Margaret into a fierce hug. "The way Thomas stood up for you, I nearly stood up and cheered." "I didn't know he was going to do that." Margaret's voice still sounded strange in her own ears. "About the dress. I thought—" "You thought he'd be embarrassed." Agnes's expression gentled. "Margaret, that man loves you. Anyone with eyes can see it." But love and acceptance weren't the same thing, Margaret had learned. She'd seen the faces in those pews, heard the whispers. And now she was expected to stand in this parish hall and make small talk with people who'd been mocking her dress 20 minutes ago. The smell of ham sandwiches and potato salad drifted from the serving table. Someone had baked a modest 2-tier cake with buttercream frosting. Nothing fancy, but Thomas had insisted they didn't need fancy. Just family and friends and food to share. His father approached first. Robert Brennan was 72, silver-haired, with the bearing of a man who'd built an empire through steel will and strategic thinking. He'd barely spoken to Margaret during the courtship, and she'd assumed he disapproved of the match entirely. "Mrs. Brennan." He extended his hand formally. "May I have a word?" Margaret's stomach knotted, but she nodded. They moved to a quieter corner near the kitchen door, where the noise of the reception faded to a manageable hum. "I owe you an apology," Robert said without preamble. "I should have intervened when Judith spoke. Should have stopped it before it got that far." "You couldn't have known." "I knew exactly what she was going to do." Robert's jaw tightened. Judith Carrington has made a career out of deciding who belongs in Louisville society and who doesn't. She's been circling this wedding like a vulture since Thomas announced your engagement. Margaret felt the familiar shame rising, but Robert held up a hand. "What I didn't know, what I should have asked Thomas about, was the dress. Caroline never told me she'd given it to you." His voice caught slightly. "We were married 40 years. I helped her into that dress on our wedding day. Saw her wear it in photographs for decades. And when she died, I thought it was gone. Lost to time and moths and all the ways things disappear when we're not paying attention." He looked at Margaret directly now, and she saw something shift in his expression. You brought it back. Not the way it was, but something new, something that honored what it had been while making it yours. Robert's voice had gone soft. That's not easy work. Rebuilding something from broken pieces. I didn't want to waste it, Margaret said quietly. She gave it to me as a gift. Throwing it away felt wrong. Caroline chose well. Robert smiled, and the warmth in it surprised her. Welcome to the family, Margaret. He walked away before she could respond, leaving Margaret standing alone near the kitchen door with tears threatening to spill over. But she didn't have time to cry. Judith Carrington materialized at her elbow like a storm cloud taking human form. Mrs. Brennan, might we speak privately? Everything in Margaret wanted to refuse, but she'd been raised with Southern manners too deeply ingrained to ignore. Of course. Judith led her out a side door into the alley behind the parish hall. Late afternoon sun slanted across the brick walls, and somewhere nearby a dog barked. The air smelled like honeysuckle and car exhaust. I'm not going to apologize, Judith said immediately. What I said in that church was true. You're not suited to be Thomas's wife. Margaret's spine straightened. Then why did you want to talk to me? Because I knew Caroline Brennan for 53 years, since we were girls at Sacred Heart Academy. I was the maid of honor at her wedding. I held her hand when she lost her first baby. I was with her the day before she died. Judith's voice had gone sharp with something that sounded almost like grief. And I know for a fact that she would never have given you that dress. The words landed like a slap. Excuse me? Caroline treasured that gown. She had it preserved in a special box with acid-free paper. She showed it to me dozens of times over the years, talked about passing it down to Thomas's wife when the time came. Judith stepped closer. So either you're lying about her giving it to you, or Thomas is lying for you. Either way, you don't belong here. Margaret's hands had curled into fists. Mrs. Brennan's assistant delivered the dress to my apartment with a note. I can show you. Notes can be forged. Thomas has access to his mother's things. Judith's expression was stone. I think you saw an opportunity and you took it. Found the dress after Caroline died, made up a story about her giving it to you, and manipulated Thomas into believing it. That's not true, isn't it? Judith tilted her head. You're a divorced single mother working at a mill. Thomas is heir to a fortune. You met him 4 months ago when he picked you up on the street. 4 months, and suddenly you're married wearing his dead mother's wedding gown. How convenient. The accusation hung between them like poison. Margaret wanted to defend herself, to explain how Caroline had invited her for tea, how gentle the older woman had been, how the gift had been offered with love. But something in Judith's expression told her that no explanation would matter. The woman had already decided Margaret was a con artist, and nothing would change her mind. Believe what you want, Margaret said finally. But I know the truth. Thomas knows the truth, and his father just welcomed me to the family. Robert's sentimental about Caroline. He'll realize his mistake soon enough. Judith adjusted her purse strap. And when he does, when Thomas wakes up and sees what you really are, you'll be back in that apartment above the hardware store with your bastard son. Mark my words. She swept back inside, leaving Margaret standing in the alley with her heart hammering. Bastard son. Danny's father had signed away his parental rights 2 years ago, but the word still carried venom, still suggested shame Margaret had spent years trying to wash clean. She wanted to follow Judith inside and scream the truth in front of everyone. Wanted to produce Carolyn's note, Call the assistant who delivered the dress. Prove beyond doubt that the gift had been real. But what good would it do? People like Judith didn't change their minds when presented with evidence. They just found new reasons to justify their contempt. Margaret pressed her palms against the brick wall, trying to steady herself. Through the open door, she could hear music starting. Someone had brought a record player, and Frank Sinatra's voice drifted into the alley. Thomas appeared in the doorway. "There you are. I've been looking everywhere. People want to—" He stopped, seeing her face. "What happened?" "Nothing." "Margaret." She couldn't lie to him, not on their wedding day. "Judith Carrington thinks I stole your mother's dress, that I made up the story about her giving it to me." Thomas's expression darkened. "She said that to you?" "It doesn't matter." "It absolutely matters." He stepped into the alley, letting the door close behind him. "Margaret, my mother gave you that dress because she saw something in you that reminded her of herself. Not the wealth or the social position, the strength, the ability to take something broken and make it beautiful again." Judith doesn't believe that. Judith is bitter and alone and terrified of anything that threatens the world she understands. Thomas took Margaret's hands. "But she doesn't get to define our marriage. She doesn't get to make you doubt what we have." Margaret wanted to believe him, wanted to lean into his certainty and let it drown out Judith's accusations. But a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that Judith was right about one thing. Margaret didn't belong in this world, would never belong, no matter how many dresses she remade or how much love Thomas offered. Some gaps couldn't be stitched closed. "Dance with me," Thomas said suddenly. "What?" "Right here, in the alley." He pulled her close, one hand at her waist, the other clasping hers. "Before we go back in there and have to smile for another 3 hours, just dance with me." Sinatra's voice filtered through the door, something slow and sweet about "the way you look tonight." Thomas swayed with her in the narrow alley, their feet shuffling over cracked concrete. And for a moment, Margaret let herself forget about Judith and whispers and belonging. This man had chosen her. That had to mean something. But what neither of them knew, Judith Carrington wasn't finished, and the seeds of doubt she'd planted would grow faster than either of them imagined. The house on Maple Street was nothing like the Brennan estate on Cherokee Road, and that was exactly why Thomas had chosen it. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with yellow linoleum that had seen better days, and a backyard just big enough for Danny to run circles in. The rent was $90 a month, which Thomas insisted on paying from his salary at Brennan Manufacturing, not from the trust fund his grandfather had established, not from dividends or investments, but from actual work. "I want us to build something ourselves," he'd told Margaret when he first showed her the place. "Not live in something my family handed me." Now, 3 weeks after the wedding, Margaret stood at the kitchen sink, washing dinner dishes, while Danny chased fireflies in the backyard. Through the window, she could see Thomas kneeling in the grass, helping Danny catch the insects in a mason jar, both of them laughing. She'd been happy here, genuinely happy. But Judith Carrington's words kept circling back like crows to carrion. "You'll be back in that apartment with your bastard son." The phone rang, sharp and insistent. Margaret dried her hands and answered on the 3rd ring. "Margaret? It's Agnes." "Hey, is everything okay?" "I don't know how to tell you this, honey." Agnes's voice was tight. "But there's been talk at the mill about you and Thomas." Margaret's stomach dropped. "What kind of talk?" "Judith Carrington's been making calls, telling people you manipulated Thomas into marrying you. That you stole his mother's wedding dress and made up a story about it being a gift. Agnes paused. Some of the girls here don't believe it, but others. Margaret, you know how gossip spreads. I didn't steal anything. Mrs. Brennan gave me that dress. I know that. But Judith's got connections everywhere. She's even been talking to people at Brennan Manufacturing, suggesting Thomas isn't thinking clearly. That you've... Agnes's voice faltered. That you've trapped him somehow. Margaret sank into a kitchen chair. Why is she doing this? Because women like Judith can't stand it when the world doesn't follow their rules. Agnes's voice had gone hard. You're supposed to stay in your place. Work at the mill, raise your kid alone, be grateful for scraps. The fact that you married up, that Thomas chose you, it threatens everything she believes about how society should work. Outside, Danny's laughter rang clear as bells. What do I do? You hold your head high and ignore her. But Agnes didn't sound convinced. Or you find a way to prove she's wrong. After they hung up, Margaret sat at the kitchen table while the light faded and her mind raced. The note from Caroline, she still had it, tucked in her jewelry box upstairs. The assistant who delivered the dress could confirm the story. Thomas's father had welcomed her to the family. But would any of that matter against a woman like Judith, who had 50 years of social connections and the ear of everyone who mattered in Louisville? Thomas came inside with Danny on his shoulders, both of them flushed and happy. We caught 7 fireflies, Danny announced, but Daddy says we have to let them go before bed. That's right, buddy. Thomas lifted Danny down. Why don't you go wash your hands for dessert? Danny raced toward the bathroom, leaving muddy footprints across the linoleum. Thomas noticed Margaret's expression immediately. What's wrong? She told him about Agnes's call, about Judith's campaign to paint her as a manipulative gold digger, about the whispers spreading through the mill and into the halls of Brennan Manufacturing itself. Thomas's jaw tightened with each detail. I'll talk to Judith, he said finally. Make her stop this. You can't stop gossip by confronting it. That just makes it spread faster. Then what do you suggest? Margaret didn't have an answer. In her experience, gossip burned itself out eventually, but not before it destroyed whatever stood in its path. Maybe I should go talk to her, Margaret said quietly. Woman to woman. Try to make her understand. She doesn't want to understand. She wants you gone. Thomas pulled Margaret close. But you're not going anywhere. We're going to weather this together. Together. The word should have been comforting, but Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. That night, after Danny was asleep and Thomas had gone to bed, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with Caroline's note spread in front of her. For Margaret. Wear it with joy. The handwriting was shaky but unmistakable. Caroline Brennan had written this note 8 days before she died, knowing she was giving away one of her most precious possessions. But why? Margaret had been too grateful at the time to question it deeply, had assumed Caroline simply wanted the dress to go to someone who would appreciate it. But now, in the quiet of her kitchen with Judith's accusations echoing in her mind, Margaret wondered if there had been something more. Had Caroline known what Judith would do? Had she anticipated the gossip and the cruelty and given Margaret the dress as armor, proof that she belonged, that she'd been chosen by the family matriarch herself? The thought was both comforting and terrifying, because if Caroline had known, if she'd understood what Margaret would face, then the gift wasn't just kindness. It was a test, a challenge to see if Margaret would fold under pressure or fight back. Margaret refolded the note and placed it back in her jewelry box. Then she went to the phone and dialed a number she'd written down weeks ago, but never called. The phone rang 4 times before a woman answered. Morrison residence. Mrs. Morrison, this is Margaret Brennan, Thomas's wife. I'm sorry to call so late, but I was hoping to speak with you about something important. Eleanor Morrison was Carolyn's younger sister, 70 years old and sharp as broken glass. She'd attended the wedding, but hadn't spoken to Margaret beyond polite pleasantries. This is about Judith Carrington, isn't it? Margaret's breath caught. You've heard. My dear, I've known Judith for 60 years. Of course I've heard. Eleanor's voice held dry amusement. She called me last week to complain about you. Spent 20 minutes explaining why you weren't suitable for Thomas. What did you say? I told her Caroline made her own choices, and those choices were none of Judith's business. A pause. Margaret, my sister didn't give away that dress lightly. She spent weeks deciding whether to offer it to you. Consulted with me, with Robert, with Thomas. She wanted to be certain. Certain of what? That you had the strength to wear it. Not just the physical dress, but everything it represented. Eleanor's voice softened. Caroline came from nothing, you know. Her father was a coal miner in eastern Kentucky. She met Robert when she was working as a secretary at his father's company. The Brennans were scandalized by the match, thought Robert was marrying beneath himself. Margaret had never known this. Thomas had never mentioned it. Caroline spent 40 years proving them wrong, Eleanor continued. Building the family reputation, supporting Robert's business, establishing herself as a force in Louisville society, and she did it all while remembering exactly where she came from. Why didn't Thomas tell me? Because Thomas sees his mother as she became, not as she began. But Caroline wanted you to know. That's why she gave you the dress, to show you that transformation is possible. That belonging isn't about where you start, but about who you choose to become. Margaret felt tears burning behind her eyes. Judith can't see that, Eleanor said. She only understands status that's inherited, not earned. But you, Margaret, you're stronger than she'll ever be. You just have to decide whether you're going to let her define you or define yourself. After they hung up, Margaret sat in the dark kitchen and let the tears fall. Caroline had given her more than a dress. She'd given her a legacy, a map for how to survive in a world that didn't want her to belong. And now Margaret had to decide whether she was brave enough to follow it. The answer came 3 days later, when Judith Carrington made her final move. Thomas came home early on a Thursday afternoon, his face drawn tight with something Margaret had never seen before: fear. Pack a bag, he said without preamble. You and Danny, we're going to my father's house for a few days. Margaret looked up from the mending in her lap. What? Why? There's a board meeting tomorrow at Brennan Manufacturing. Emergency session. Thomas loosened his tie with jerky movements. Judith's convinced 3 board members that I'm mentally unfit to take over the company. That you've... He stopped, jaw working. That you've manipulated me into marriage and I'm making irrational decisions. The sewing fell from Margaret's hands. She can do that? She's on the board. So is her husband. They have influence with the shareholders. Thomas sank onto the couch beside her. My father called an hour ago. Said I need to bring you to the estate, let the board members see us together. Prove we're a solid partnership. Or what? Or they vote to delay my succession. Keep me in a junior position for another 5 years while someone else runs the company. His voice had gone hollow. Everything my grandfather built, everything my father maintained. Judith's trying to take it away because she doesn't approve of you." Margaret felt the old shame rising, the familiar whisper that she was poison to everything she touched. Her first marriage had ended in violence and divorce. Now her second was threatening to destroy Thomas's entire future. "Maybe I should leave," she said quietly. "Go back to the apartment for a while. Give you space to handle this without me in the way." "No." Thomas grabbed her hands. "That's exactly what Judith wants. She wants to isolate us, make you think you're the problem. But Margaret, you're not the problem. She is. She's on the board of your family's company. I'm nobody. You're my wife. That makes you somebody." But the certainty in his voice couldn't quite mask the fear underneath. They packed that evening. Danny was excited about staying at the big house, as he called the Brennan estate. But Margaret felt like she was walking toward a gallows. Robert Brennan met them at the door, his expression grave. "Come in. Eleanor's already here. She drove up from Lexington when I called." The estate smelled like furniture polish and old money, leather and cedar and generations of accumulated wealth. Eleanor Morrison sat in the parlor with a glass of sherry, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her eyes sharp as she assessed Margaret. "There's the girl of the hour." Eleanor stood, crossing to Margaret with surprising speed for a 70-year-old woman. "Let me look at you." She circled Margaret like a jeweler examining a stone, taking in the simple cotton dress, the worn flats, the hands that showed calluses from millwork, despite 3 weeks of marriage. "You're terrified," Eleanor said finally. "Good. That means you understand what's at stake." "Eleanor, don't make this harder," Robert said. "I'm not making it harder. I'm making it clear." Eleanor turned to Thomas. "Tomorrow morning, Margaret needs to attend that board meeting with you, not as decoration, but as your partner." Thomas's eyes widened. The board meetings are closed. Even family members don't usually. Caroline attended board meetings for 30 years, sat beside Robert, asked questions, made observations. The board respected her because she showed up and proved she understood the business. Eleanor's gaze fixed on Margaret. "That's what you're going to do." Margaret's stomach turned to ice. "I don't know anything about manufacturing, about furniture or lumber or—" "You know about work, about quality, about what it means to build something with your own hands." Eleanor's voice had gone sharp. "Caroline told me you work at Hartley Textiles. 3rd shift on the cutting floor. Is that right?" "Yes, ma'am." "For how long?" 3 years. "And before that?" "I was a seamstress at Livy's department store, alterations department." Eleanor smiled, and it was a predator's smile. "So you've spent your entire adult life working with fabric, understanding construction, durability, craftsmanship. Tell me, Margaret, when you look at a piece of furniture, what do you see?" The question caught Margaret off guard. She thought of the chairs in her apartment, the table Thomas had bought them, the dresser in Danny's room. "I see how it's put together," she said slowly. "Whether the joints are solid, whether the fabric on a cushion is going to wear well or fray, whether it's built to last or just built to look good in a showroom." "Exactly." Eleanor turned to Robert. "Brennan Manufacturing has been losing market share for 2 years. You've told me that yourself. Competitors are making cheaper furniture, flooding the market with pieces that fall apart in 18 months. And you've been struggling to decide whether to compete on price or double down on quality." Robert nodded slowly. "That's the central debate. The board's divided. Then Margaret's perspective is valuable. She understands quality from a worker's viewpoint, not just a profit margin. Eleanor looked at Margaret. Tomorrow, you're going to sit in that meeting and you're going to speak up when they discuss manufacturing processes. You're going to show those board members that you're not some ignorant mill worker who trapped their golden boy. You're a woman who understands craftsmanship at a fundamental level. Eleanor, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but Margaret's voice faltered. They're not going to listen to me. They've already decided what I am. Some of them have, but 3 board members are still undecided. They're waiting to see whether Thomas has made a mistake or a strategic choice. Eleanor's expression softened slightly. My sister married into this family from nothing. She survived by being useful, by making herself indispensable in ways that had nothing to do with social status. That's what you have to do tomorrow. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay beside Thomas in one of the estate's guest rooms, a space bigger than her entire apartment had been, and stared at the ceiling while fear gnawed at her insides. She didn't belong here, didn't belong in board meetings or estates or anywhere near decisions that affected hundreds of workers and millions of dollars. But Danny was sleeping down the hall in a room with a canopy bed and toys Robert had saved from Thomas's childhood. And Thomas was beside her, his breathing steady, trusting her to be strong enough for both of them. At 2 a.m, Margaret got up and went downstairs to the library. She'd seen it earlier. Walls of books, a massive desk, filing cabinets that probably held decades of company records. She wasn't sure what she was looking for until she found the annual reports. Brennan Manufacturing, 1960 through 1969. 9 years of production data, sales figures, market analysis. Margaret spread them across the desk and started reading. By dawn, her eyes burned and her head ached, but she understood something she hadn't before. Brennan Manufacturing wasn't losing money. They were losing identity. The reports showed a slow drift from custom, high-quality pieces toward mass production. Cheaper materials, faster assembly, lower prices to compete with imports. And with each year, customer satisfaction scores dropped, while return rates climbed. The company was drowning in mediocrity, trying to be something it had never been designed to be. Margaret thought about the wedding dress, how she'd taken Caroline's ruined gown and rebuilt it into something new, not by making it cheaper or faster, but by preserving what had been valuable and reimagining it for a different purpose. Maybe Brennan Manufacturing needed the same approach. When Thomas found her at 6 a.m, surrounded by papers and half-drunk coffee, he stopped in the doorway. How long have you been up? All night. Margaret looked up, and something in her expression must have changed because Thomas's eyes widened. I think I know what to tell the board. The morning sun climbed higher, painting the library in gold, and Margaret Porter Brennan, mill worker and single mother and woman who rebuilt broken things, prepared to walk into a room full of men who thought she didn't belong. She was about to show them what strength looked like when it wore a handmade dress. The boardroom at Brennan Manufacturing smelled like coffee and cologne, and the particular tension that comes when powerful men gather to make decisions about other people's futures. Margaret sat beside Thomas at the long mahogany table, her hands folded in her lap to keep them from shaking. 8 board members occupied the other seats. Robert at the head, Judith and her husband Wallace across from Margaret, and 5 other men whose names she'd memorized from the annual reports, but whose faces still swam together in her nervousness. Eleanor had positioned herself near the door, technically not part of the meeting, but present as Robert's guest. Her eyes caught Margaret's, offering silent encouragement. Let's begin. Robert's voice cut through the murmur of conversation, We're here to address concerns raised by Mrs. Carrington regarding Thomas's readiness to assume leadership of Brennan Manufacturing. Judith leaned forward, her expression composed but her eyes hard. Thank you, Robert. I want to be clear. This isn't personal. It's about protecting the company our families have built over 3 generations. She opened a leather portfolio and pulled out several typed pages. Thomas has made a series of questionable decisions in recent months. First, he moved out of the family estate into a rental property in a marginal neighborhood. Second, he married a woman he'd known for only 4 months, a divorced single mother with no education beyond high school and no understanding of the business world we operate in. Judith's gaze flicked to Margaret. Third, he's been advocating for changes to our production model that would significantly increase costs at a time when we're already struggling to compete. Those changes would improve quality, Thomas said, his voice tight. Quality doesn't matter if we can't sell the furniture. Wallace Carrington spoke up, his jowls quivering with certainty. Consumers want cheap. They want furniture they can afford to replace every few years. We're not in the heirloom business anymore. Margaret felt Thomas tense beside her. They'd discussed this exact argument last night, the central tension tearing the company apart. May I say something? Margaret's voice was quieter than she'd intended, but it carried across the table. Judith's eyebrows rose. This is a board meeting, Mrs. Brennan, not a public forum. Let her speak, Robert said firmly. She's family now, and according to Eleanor, she has relevant expertise. Expertise? Judith's tone dripped skepticism. In what exactly? Hemming trousers? The barb hit its mark, but Margaret had spent the last 6 hours preparing for exactly this kind of dismissal. In understanding what workers actually need, Margaret said, meeting Judith's eyes. I've spent 3 years on the cutting floor at Hartley Textiles. Before that, 5 years in alterations at Levy's. I've worked with fabric and construction and quality control since I was 16 years old. She reached into the folder she'd brought and pulled out the production reports she'd studied all night. Brennan Manufacturing has been making furniture for 73 years. For most of that time, you built pieces that lasted generations. Chairs that could be reupholstered, tables that could be refinished, dressers that survived moves and marriages and children climbing on them. Margaret's hands had stopped shaking. But look at the returns data from the last 3 years. She slid a chart across the table. Thomas had helped her make it that morning, translating her observations into graphs the board would understand. Returns have increased by 42%. Customer complaints about broken joints, split wood, and failing hardware have tripled, and your repeat customer rate has dropped from 68% to 31%. Margaret paused. You're losing the customers who built your reputation because they can't trust your furniture anymore. Wallace frowned. The market has changed. Consumers expect lower prices. Some consumers do, but the ones who made Brennan Manufacturing successful, the ones who valued craftsmanship, they're still out there. They're just buying from your competitors now. Margaret pulled out another sheet. I called 6 furniture stores yesterday. Asked about who's buying high-quality furniture in Louisville. You know what they told me? The room had gone quiet. Young professionals, people starting families, they want furniture that will last because they can't afford to replace it every few years. They're willing to pay more up front for something durable. Margaret looked at Wallace. You're competing in the wrong market. Instead of racing to the bottom on price, you should be rebuilding your reputation for quality. That's where the loyal customers are. That's a lovely theory, Judith said coldly. But theory doesn't pay bills. We need to move product, not chase some fantasy of artisan furniture that nobody wants. Somebody wants it. Margaret's voice hardened. The stores I called said they can't keep quality furniture in stock. There's demand. You're just not meeting it anymore. One of the other board members, Harold Jenkins, who owned lumber mills in 3 counties, leaned forward. How would you suggest we rebuild that reputation, Mrs. Brennan? Margaret glanced at Thomas, who nodded encouragement. Start with a heritage line. Bring back your original designs from the 1940s and 50s. Use the same materials, the same construction methods. Market it as furniture built the way your grandparents built it, to last. She warmed to the idea, words coming faster. You have 70 years of customer loyalty to tap into. People remember Brennan furniture in their parents' homes. Give them a reason to buy it for their own children. That would require significant retooling, Wallace objected. Training workers on old techniques, sourcing better materials. It would also differentiate you from every discount furniture store flooding the market. Eleanor spoke up from the doorway. Caroline and I discussed this exact strategy 3 months before she died. She was concerned the company was losing its identity. Judith's face flushed. Caroline never mentioned that to me. Because she knew you'd oppose it. Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. Judith, you've been a loyal friend and a valuable board member. But you're wrong about this. And you're wrong about Margaret. I'm wrong about a mill worker who trapped Thomas into marriage. Enough. Robert's hand came down on the table. Judith, I've been patient with your concerns. But this crosses a line. Margaret has presented a thoughtful analysis backed by data. Whether we implement her suggestions or not, she's earned the right to be heard. She's earned nothing. Judith stood, her chair scraping back. You're all so bedazzled by this Cinderella story that you can't see what's really happening. Thomas has made an emotional decision that's clouding his judgment. And if we let him take over the company in this state, we'll be bankrupt in 5 years. Then put it to a vote. Thomas stood as well, his voice steady. Right now. Vote on whether I'm fit to lead Brennan Manufacturing, and vote on whether we should explore Margaret's suggestion for a heritage line. The room went silent. Robert looked around the table. All in favor of affirming Thomas's succession plan as originally scheduled? 6 hands rose immediately. Robert, Eleanor, Harold Jenkins, and 3 others. Judith and Wallace kept their hands down. Motion passes. Robert's expression was grave. Thomas, you'll assume the CEO position as planned in January of 1970. Now, regarding the heritage line proposal, I withdraw my opposition. Harold Jenkins surprised everyone. Mrs. Brennan makes a compelling case. I'd like to see a full feasibility study before we commit resources, but the concept has merit. One by one, the other board members nodded agreement. Even Wallace, though his expression suggested he was swallowing glass. Only Judith remained rigid. This is a mistake, she said quietly. All of it. And when it falls apart, don't say I didn't warn you. She gathered her portfolio and walked out, leaving the boardroom door swinging behind her. Margaret felt the tension drain from her body so completely, she thought she might slide out of her chair. Thomas's hand found hers under the table, squeezing tight. Well, Robert said into the silence, I think that concludes our meeting. Thomas, Margaret, stay for a moment. The rest of you are dismissed. After the boardroom emptied, Robert stood and moved to the window overlooking the factory floor below. Workers moved between machinery, cutting and sanding, and assembling the furniture that bore the Brennan name. Margaret, you surprised me today. Robert turned back to face them. I expected you to be intimidated. Instead, you came, prepared, and spoke with authority. I just told the truth as I see it. The truth backed by research and data. Robert smiled slightly. That's what Caroline would have done. She never walked into a meeting without knowing more than everyone else in the room. Eleanor appeared in the doorway. Judith's in the parking lot, by the way, crying in her car. Margaret felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. Should someone talk to her? Leave her be. Eleanor's voice was kind but firm. Judith needs to grieve the world she thought she understood. That takes time. As they left the building, Margaret looked back at the Brennan manufacturing sign. 73 years of family history forged in metal and wood. She'd walked into that boardroom as an outsider, a mill worker in a borrowed dress. She'd walked out as someone who belonged. But late that night, as Margaret lay in bed beside Thomas, she thought about Judith crying in her car, about a woman who'd spent 60 years building a life around certain assumptions, only to watch them crumble. And Margaret wondered, what would she do when her own certainties fell apart? The answer would come sooner than she expected. Spring arrived in Louisville with dogwood blossoms and the kind of gentle rain that made everything smell like new beginnings. Margaret stood in the Brennan manufacturing showroom, watching workers arrange furniture for the Heritage Line launch. Each piece had been built over the past 4 months using techniques pulled from 70-year-old blueprints. Dovetail joints instead of staples, solid oak instead of particle board, hand-rubbed finishes instead of spray lacquer. Thomas moved among the displays, adjusting a chair here, straightening a table placard there. He'd thrown himself into the project with an intensity that surprised even his father, spending long hours on the factory floor, learning the old construction methods alongside workers who remembered when Brennan furniture was something you passed down to your grandchildren. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said, appearing at Margaret's elbow. "Caroline would have loved this." "I hope so." Margaret still felt the weight of that responsibility. The idea that she'd somehow channeled Caroline's vision without ever really knowing the woman. More than the furniture, she would have loved what you've done for Thomas. Eleanor watched her nephew across the showroom. He was drifting before you, going through the motions of being groomed for leadership without any real passion. Now look at him. Margaret looked, saw Thomas laughing with a craftsman, examining a joint with genuine interest, his whole body animated with purpose. "He found something worth fighting for," Eleanor continued. "Not just the company, but a way of doing business that honors the past while building something sustainable for the future." The launch event that evening drew a surprising crowd. Young couples Margaret's age mixing with older customers who remembered buying Brennan furniture decades earlier. The mayor attended, along with reporters from both Louisville newspapers and a journalist from Southern Living magazine who'd driven up from Nashville specifically to cover the story. And in the back corner, partially hidden behind a display of bedroom furniture, stood Judith Carrington. Margaret noticed her an hour into the event. The older woman wore navy blue, always navy blue, and stood perfectly still, watching the crowd circulate through the showroom with an expression Margaret couldn't quite read. "I should go talk to her," Margaret said to Thomas. "Are you sure?" "No, but I think I need to." Margaret wove through the crowd, accepting congratulations and answering questions about the production process, until she reached Judith's corner. "Mrs. Carrington, I'm glad you came." Judith startled slightly, as if she'd hoped to remain unnoticed. "I wasn't going to, but Wallace insisted." She gestured vaguely toward her husband, who was examining a dining table with Harold Jenkins. "He's already talking about investing in the expansion." "I'm glad. The initial orders have exceeded projections. Yes, I read the production reports. Judith's voice was flat. It seems I was wrong about market demand. The admission hung between them. Mrs. Carrington, Judith, I never wanted to be your enemy. I know. Judith's eyes finally met Margaret's. That's what makes this so difficult. If you'd been the gold digger I wanted you to be, I could have maintained my righteousness. But you're not. You're exactly what Thomas needed, and exactly what this company needed. And I spent 6 months trying to destroy you because I couldn't accept that the world had changed. The raw honesty in her voice surprised Margaret. Caroline saw it, Judith continued. Saw the company losing its way. Saw Thomas needing direction. Saw you as the catalyst for both. She tried to tell me the week before she died. Said I was clinging to the past instead of honoring it. I thought she was confused from the medication. She wasn't confused. No. She was clear-sighted in a way I refused to be. Judith's hands twisted around her purse strap. I owe you an apology, Margaret. A real one, not the social nicety I'm supposed to offer. I was cruel to you. Tried to sabotage your marriage and Thomas's future because I couldn't bear the idea that people like you— She stopped, correcting herself. That people who work with their hands and rebuild broken things might understand quality better than people who've only ever purchased it. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. Not forgiveness, that would take time, but the beginning of understanding. My mother was a seamstress, Judith said quietly. Before she married my father and became a society wife, she used to let me sit in her sewing room and watch her work. The way she could take fabric and transform it into something beautiful. I loved that. But when I got older, when I entered Louisville society properly, I learned to be ashamed of those memories. Learned that women like my mother, like you, were supposed to be invisible. They don't have to be. I'm beginning to understand that. Judith managed a small smile. This furniture, the heritage line, it's not about going backward. It's about remembering that quality requires skill, and skill requires respect for the people who possess it. They stood together in silence, watching the crowd admire furniture built by workers whose names would never appear in marketing materials, but whose craftsmanship spoke for itself. I can't undo the damage I caused, Judith said finally. The things I said about you, the gossip I spread, it's out there. But I can stop, and I can use my influence to counter the narrative I created. That would mean a lot. Consider it done. Judith straightened her shoulders. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go congratulate my nephew on his excellent business sense. She walked away, leaving Margaret alone with the realization that even the fiercest enemies could become unexpected allies when faced with truth they couldn't deny. The evening wound down past midnight. Danny had fallen asleep on a display sofa, his rabbit clutched tight, while Thomas and Robert tallied orders and discussed production schedules. Eleanor found Margaret sitting on the showroom floor beside her sleeping son, exhaustion finally catching up. You did it, Eleanor said, sliding down to sit beside her. Built something real from broken pieces. We did it, all of us. Don't diminish your role. You're the one who saw what others couldn't see. That quality matters. That craftsmanship has value. That the old ways could inform new solutions. Eleanor's voice was warm. Caroline knew what she was doing when she gave you that dress. Margaret thought about the wedding gown, now carefully preserved in a garment bag at home. The dress she'd worn once and would probably never wear again, but would keep forever as a reminder of where she'd come from and how far she'd traveled. I've been thinking. Margaret said slowly. About starting a program at the factory, teaching craftsmanship skills to people like me, single mothers, workers who want to move beyond assembly lines, people who understand labor but haven't had access to specialized training. A trade school. Something like that. Combine traditional techniques with modern production. Give people skills that can't be outsourced or automated. Eleanor smiled. Caroline would have loved that idea, and I happen to know the board would support it, especially after tonight's success. Thomas appeared above them, Danny in his arms. Ready to go home? Home. The word settled warm and solid in Margaret's chest. They drove through quiet Louisville streets, past the apartment above Donnelly's Hardware where Margaret had once sewn by lamplight, past the mill where she'd worked third shift, past St. Catherine's Church where she'd been mocked and defended in equal measure. And Margaret realized something. She didn't need Louisville society to accept her. Didn't need Judith's approval or the validation of women who measured worth in pearls and pedigree. She'd built her own foundation, stitch by stitch, decision by decision, honest word by honest word. And on that foundation, she could build anything. But as they pulled into the driveway of the house on Maple Street, a car sat waiting at the curb. A woman emerged as they parked, mid-30s, expensively dressed, with Danny's exact eyes and chin. Margaret's blood turned to ice. Sarah Porter, Danny's mother. The woman who'd walked out 4 years ago and never looked back. "Hello, Margaret," Sarah said, her voice pleasant as poison. "I heard you got married, moved up in the world. I thought it was time we had a conversation about custody arrangements." The foundation Margaret had just finished building began to crack. Danny stirred in Thomas's arms, his eyes opening slowly before focusing on the woman standing beneath the streetlight. Recognition dawned immediately, some ancestral memory of the voice that had sung him lullabies before disappearing forever. "Mama?" The word was small, confused, directed at Margaret. Then, looking at Sarah, "Who's that?" "I'm your mother, sweetheart." Sarah's smile was practiced, perfect. "Your first mother. I've come back for you." Margaret stepped between Sarah and her son with the instinct of a lioness protecting her cub. "Danny, go inside with Thomas, now." "But..." "Now." Thomas carried Danny toward the house, the boys' protests fading as the door closed behind them. Margaret turned to face the woman who'd abandoned her child at 2 years old, who'd signed away her parental rights without looking back, who'd chosen a new husband and a fresh start over the boy she'd carried for 9 months. "You have no custody to rearrange," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "You signed termination papers. Danny is legally mine." Signed under duress. Sarah pulled a folder from her car. "My lawyer reviewed the documents. I was suffering from postpartum depression, wasn't thinking clearly, didn't have proper legal representation. Any judge would overturn it." "You waited 4 years to suddenly remember that?" "I've been getting treatment, therapy, medication, working through my issues." Sarah's tone was reasonable, measured, the voice of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. "And now I'm stable, remarried to a good man who wants to be a father to Danny. We have a house in Cincinnati, good schools, opportunities you could never provide on a mill worker's salary. I don't work at the mill anymore. No, you married money instead. Very clever." Sarah's smile sharpened. "But here's the thing, Margaret. I read about your wedding in the society pages, saw the photos of your handmade dress, the gossip about you being unsuitable for Thomas Brennan. What do you think a judge will say when I explain that you've dragged my son into a world of social climbing and scandal?" The words landed like blows, But Margaret had spent 6 months learning to stand her ground against women who wielded cruelty like weapons. A judge will say that Danny has lived with me for 4 years, that I've fed him and clothed him and sat up with him through nightmares and fevers, that I've been the only mother he's known since he could form memories. Margaret's voice didn't waver. You're not his mother, Sarah. You're the woman who gave birth to him. Those aren't the same thing. We'll let the courts decide. Why now? Margaret stepped closer, searching Sarah's face. Why come back after all this time? For a moment, something flickered behind Sarah's polished exterior, something raw and desperate. Because I made a mistake, Sarah said quietly. Because I was young and scared, and I ran from the hardest thing I'd ever faced. And every day for 4 years, I've lived with the knowledge that somewhere out there, my son is growing up without me. So this is about easing your guilt. This is about giving Danny the life he deserves. 2 parents, financial security, a mother who's finally ready to love him the way I should have from the beginning. Margaret wanted to believe that was impossible, that judges would see through Sarah's manufactured redemption story. But she knew better. Had seen too many cases where biological parents reclaimed children from foster homes and loving guardians, where blood trumped bonds forged through years of actual parenting. If you take him to court, you'll traumatize him, Margaret said. He doesn't remember you, doesn't understand why some stranger is claiming to be his mother. Is that really what you want? To put him through that pain just so you can feel better about abandoning him? Sarah's composure cracked slightly. I'm not trying to hurt him. I'm trying to be his mother. Then be his mother from a distance. Send him letters, birthday cards. Let him know you exist and that you're sorry for leaving. But don't rip him away from the only home he's ever known. Would you accept that arrangement? If Danny wanted to know me? The question was genuine, and Margaret realized Sarah was offering something. Not surrender, but negotiation. I would never keep you from him if he wanted a relationship with you, Margaret said carefully. But it has to be his choice, not yours, not mine. His. He's 4 years old. He can't make that choice yet. Then wait until he can. They stood in the spring darkness, 2 women who'd both loved the same child in different ways and different times, trying to find a path that wouldn't destroy him. I'll make you a deal, Sarah said finally. I won't file for custody if you agree to let me visit. Once a month, supervised, just so Danny can know I exist, so that when he's old enough to ask questions, he'll have memories instead of mysteries. Everything in Margaret wanted to refuse, to protect Danny from this woman who'd already hurt him once. But she thought about the wedding dress, about taking broken things and rebuilding them into something new. Maybe families could be rebuilt too. Awkwardly, imperfectly, but rebuilt nonetheless. Supervised visits at our house, Margaret said. Thomas and I present, and if Danny ever says he doesn't want to see you, the visits stop immediately. Agreed. They stood in silence for another moment, the truce fragile as new ice. I'm sorry, Sarah said quietly, for what I put you through, for making you raise my son alone, for showing up now and threatening everything you've built. Are you sorry enough to actually show up for him this time? Or will you disappear again the moment it gets hard? I don't know. The honesty surprised Margaret. I hope I'm different now. I hope the therapy and the time and the second chance I've been given made me strong enough to be what Danny needs, but I can't promise I won't fail again. Then don't make promises, Margaret said. Just show up. That's all any parent can do. Sarah got back in her car and drove away, leaving Margaret standing alone beneath the streetlight with her heart hammering. Inside, Thomas had put Danny to bed, but the boy was still awake, his eyes wide and worried when Margaret entered his room. Was that really my other mama? Margaret sat on the edge of his bed, smoothing his hair. Yes, baby. That was the woman who gave birth to you. Why did she leave? Because she was scared and didn't know how to be a mama yet. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes. Is she gonna take me away? No. Margaret's voice was firm. You're staying right here with me and Thomas, but she might come visit sometimes, if that's okay with you. Danny considered this with the seriousness of a child navigating adult complexities he couldn't fully understand. Will you still be my real mama? Always. Forever. Nothing will ever change that. He fell asleep holding her hand, his breathing evening out as the fear drained away. Thomas found her there an hour later, still sitting vigil. Is he okay? He will be. Margaret stood, her joints stiff from sitting so long. We all will be. They walked downstairs together, and Margaret told him about the arrangement with Sarah, the supervised visits, the tentative truce, the hope that maybe damage could be managed if not fully repaired. You're stronger than anyone I've ever met, Thomas said when she finished. I'm terrified. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. 6 months later, on a crisp October morning in 1970, Margaret stood in the Brennan Manufacturing Training Center, a converted warehouse where 20 students sat at workbenches learning dovetail joints and mortise and tenon construction. Half were single mothers. A quarter were former mill workers looking to develop specialized skills. The rest were young people who wanted to learn a trade that couldn't be outsourced or automated. Sarah had visited 3 times, awkward supervised afternoons where she and Danny colored together while Margaret and Thomas watched from the kitchen. The visits were strained but not hostile, and Danny had started asking questions about his first mama with curiosity instead of fear. The heritage line had exceeded all projections. Brennan Manufacturing had expanded production and opened a second showroom in Nashville. Thomas had hired 6 more craftsmen trained in traditional methods, and the waiting list for custom pieces stretched 8 months. And Judith Carrington had quietly used her social influence to reshape the narrative around Margaret, no longer the gold digger who'd trapped Thomas, but the visionary who'd saved the family company. Eleanor appeared at Margaret's elbow as the training session wrapped up. Caroline would be so proud of what you've built here. I just gave people the same chance I needed, a way to rebuild themselves from broken pieces. That's exactly what makes it powerful. As the students filed out, chattering about techniques and assignments, Margaret thought about the wedding dress still hanging in her closet. The gown rebuilt from ruins, transformed into something new while honoring what had been valuable in the original. She'd done the same with her life, taken poverty and divorce and shame and rebuilt them into strength, purpose, and belonging. And she'd learned that the most beautiful things were often made from the pieces others had discarded. Some people in Louisville still whisper about the wedding, about the bride in the homemade dress who changed everything. They say if you visit the Brennan Manufacturing showroom, you can see a photograph near the entrance. Margaret and Thomas on their wedding day, her in that cream-colored gown, both of them smiling with a joy that had nothing to do with money or status or society's approval. And they say the dress itself is displayed in the training center now, behind glass like a museum piece, with a plaque that reads, "Built from what was broken, made stronger in the rebuilding." If this story moved you, Take a moment to share it with someone who needs to hear that belonging isn't about where you start. It's about who you choose to become. And subscribe for more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, one stitch at a time.